Okay, in the last video we looked at how businesses have profit motivated and want to maximise their profits, and that they're likely to shift resources into areas where they're going to generate the highest relative profits. So in this video we're going to look at how different incentives, starting off with subsidies and tariffs, can influence producers' decision making based on how it affects either their cost of production or the amount of revenue they're generating. So businesses will respond to positive and negative incentives. The ultimate aim is for businesses to make a higher profit. So if there's an increased demand for a product, this will generally lead to a higher price, and self-interested producers will shift their resources. When we mean the resources, we're talking about land, labour and capital. So for example, if there's a higher price of wine, producers might allocate some more of their land towards wine. They might get more of their workers picking grapes to produce more wine, and so on and so forth. As the price of a product falls, if assuming that price is falling because of weaker demand, it becomes less profitable and resources flow out of that market. So it's changes in relative prices that affect relative profitability, and that provides the incentive for businesses to either shift resources into that area or away to that area, depending on what's most profitable. So businesses will respond to a range of different incentives, and taxes, subsidies and tariffs can all influence businesses' production costs or their level of demand for their products and impact the way that they do business or whether they shift resources to that area. So in this video we're going to look at how subsidies and lower tariffs work to try and encourage production in certain areas and away from certain areas. So the idea with subsidies is they lower firms' cost of production and make particular industries more profitable. So one positive incentive to encourage production is the government can provide production subsidies. The idea of the subsidy is that we're just giving businesses a certain amount of money, so we can give them cash. There's other forms of subsidies, like you can give them interest-free loans or certain tax concessions for investing in certain things. But the main type of subsidy is just a cash payment, which acts to reduce firms' cost of production and provides an incentive to produce particular goods and services because it lowers their cost of production, so that allows them to lower their prices and then essentially make more money out of the lower prices. So the main industries that the government will subsidise is farmers. They will subsidise farmers, particularly those that are impacted by droughts, to help sustain livestock and grow crops. So the idea is that these industries have positive externalities or positive benefits for the rest of society, and therefore the government will subsidise them to lower their cost of production so they can remain viable, remain profitable, and therefore society can benefit from the produce that they're producing. The government also used to subsidise the car manufacturing industry. The idea of that was to protect them against foreign imports. So when the government removed the subsidy, a lot of these industries could no longer survive. So these industries were getting, particularly the car industry, was getting supported by about $1.3 billion worth of subsidies. The idea of that is the government gave them money so that will help to lower their cost of production so they could charge cheaper prices for cars, and therefore they could compete against foreign products like Kia and Jaguars and so on and so forth. But what's happened is the government's reduced the amount of subsidies they're giving these industries, and that's led to the closing down of companies like Ford and GM Holden and Toyota and things like that, because they can no longer compete because their cost of production, their wages, etc. are a lot higher than overseas countries. So you can see here, this is the amount of assistance the government gives to the motor vehicle industry. You can see how it's going down, and since 2010, 2011, it's continued to go down, which has made them a lot less competitive with foreign products. Lower tariffs is another incentive that businesses can do. The idea of lower tariffs is to provide an incentive for businesses to undergo structural change. So what I mean by that is that they might update their facilities, they might get rid of middle management, certain ways they can lower their cost structures so they can become more competitive and more efficient. They might pay their people based on output rather than just on a wage, so that encourages them to increase their productivity. Higher tariffs often lead to inefficiency because Australian producers are protected against the threat of cheaper imports. So the price of imports, if they've got a 50% tariff on them, they're going to be 50% higher, so the Australian business can therefore be less productive and still remain in business. Lowering tariffs is all about trying to promote the survival of the fittest mentality. Businesses can only survive if they're able to compete against foreign imports, and therefore that encourages them to be more technically efficient, because if they can't do so, they will go out of business because they can't compete against the cheaper prices from overseas. Lower tariffs force businesses to restructure their operations, to implement new technology, to adapt more efficient work practices in order to raise productivity and lower their costs of production. This is good for Australians because these cost savings are passed on in the form of lower prices, so we get access to cheaper goods, but the businesses have to do this to improve their international competitiveness and compete against importing firms. The idea of lowering tariffs is not just that businesses will restructure and become more efficient, but it will also lead to the eradication of industries where we don't have comparative advantage. So it will get rid of those industries where we aren't efficient because they're no longer protected, and will shift resources into areas of comparative advantage. So if you look in Australia, the tariff rate in the 90s was about 40%. So if you're buying a car for $20,000, you're paying an extra $8,000 tariff on top of that. In the 70s and 80s, they were even higher. They were up towards 55% to 60%. Now, most tariffs are around 5%. We've signed free trade agreements with Japan, for example, where we have tariffs of 0%. But for most countries, we still have tariffs at around 4 to 5%. Some industries, what will happen when we lower the tariffs is some industries will not be able to compete or adapt. So these industries that aren't highly competitive will have to shut down, and we will shift resources to areas where we have comparative advantage, which basically means areas where we specialise in those areas where we have a lower opportunity cost, and therefore the idea is to maximise the level of output by specialising. So Australia will specialise in areas like minerals, beef, wine, education, tourism, and biotech products, with the idea that we will generate more revenue in those areas, which will compensate for the revenue that's been lost in areas where we don't have comparative advantage. So the theory of comparative advantage is we specialise in areas where we have a lower opportunity cost, and that should help to maximise our level of output because we're doing things that we're essentially better at. Any extra production can be exported, and the income earned from those exporting can be used to import goods and services that Australia doesn't produce. So we'll export more, we'll import more, based on areas of comparative advantage. And we talked about comparative advantage in class when we did Chapter 1. It's basically where we have the lower opportunity cost. So for country A, every time they produce a car, they have to give up 1 unit of rice. You just do the other one over. For country B, every time they produce a car, they have to give up 4 units of rice. So 200 divided by 50. So in terms of cars, country A has comparative advantage, where with example for the second one with rice, again, it's 1 unit of rice for country A, but for country B, 50 divided by 200, they're only giving up 1/4 of a unit of rice every time they produce rice, 1/4 of a car, sorry, so they would have comparative advantage in rice, and therefore they would specialise in rice. Thank you.